September 11, 1945. Late afternoon. A quiet suburb of Tokyo called Setagaya, 12 miles from the shattered city centre, past the rubble fields where wooden neighbourhoods used to stand, past the charred foundations and the open lots where nothing grows, down a narrow lane bordered by drooping cornfields and wild hedges. An American Army counterintelligence team pulls up outside a modest 2-story house, surrounded by a low fence, and a crowd of reporters who have been camped on the road for 2 days waiting for exactly this moment. Major Paul Krauss and Lieutenant John Wilpers, Jr. of the 308th Counterintelligence Detachment step out of their jeep. They have brought an Associated Press reporter named Merlin Spencer to guide them, because Spencer is one of the journalists who interviewed the occupant of this house just yesterday. The occupant is the most hated man in the Pacific War, the man who gave the order for Pearl Harbor, the man whose empire starved, tortured, and killed Allied prisoners of war at a rate 7 times higher than the Germans. The man American newspapers have been calling the Devil of the Pacific since 1942, and whose face has appeared on more propaganda posters than any other Axis leader except Hitler himself. His name is Hideki Tojo, former general of the Imperial Japanese Army, former Prime Minister of Japan, former War Minister, former Home Minister. The man who held more simultaneous governmental power than any figure in modern Japanese history, and he has been living alone in this house since sending his wife to friends in Fukuoka weeks ago. He kept 1 elderly servant and a single Japanese policeman as a guard. He had the windows shuttered. He had the doors locked from the inside. And he had, in the days before this afternoon, quietly taken one final precaution that the Americans did not yet know about. The crowd outside is considerable. In addition to Spencer, there is Russell Brines of the Associated Press, George Burns of Yank magazine, Clark Lee of International News Service, Cornelius Ryan of the London Daily Telegraph, the same Cornelius Ryan who would later write The Longest Day, the definitive account of the Normandy invasion, George E. Jones of the New York Times. A pack of wire photographers with cameras ready. They are all here because they know the arrest is coming. Some of them have been here since dawn. Krauss approaches the front door with his interpreter. There is no answer. He moves to the side of the house. A sliding window panel opens on the upper floor. Tojo's face appears. He is 60 years old. His hair is cropped short. He is wearing a white sports shirt and khaki military trousers tucked into high boots. He looks, according to the reporters who can see him, exactly like the photographs from the war, except thinner. Krauss speaks through the interpreter. He tells Tojo to open the door so he can come in and present his credentials. Tojo stalls. He says that unless this is an official order, he does not care to discuss anything. Krauss, who has been given very clear instructions from General MacArthur's headquarters, loses patience. He tells the interpreter to tell this man to quit the damn fooling around and prepare himself for a trip to Yokohama. Tojo looks at Krauss for a long moment. Then he closes the window with a bang. For 4 minutes, nobody moves. The reporters shift on their feet. The photographers check their shutters. Somewhere inside the house, a man who once commanded an empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the border of India, from the coast of China to the jungles of New Guinea, is making a decision that has been waiting for him since the Emperor's voice came through the radio on August 15 and told the Japanese people that the war was over. At 4:21, a single gunshot cracks through the afternoon air. Wilpers and Krauss rush the front door. It is locked. They force it open. Wilpers charges down a dim hallway to the study door. It has been barricaded from the inside with furniture. He kicks it in. He enters the room with his pistol drawn and finds Tojo slumped in a low chair, his legs crossed in the ceremonial position of seppuku, blood spreading in a wide dark stain across his white shirt. A .32 caliber Colt pistol lies on the floor where it has fallen from his hand. On the table beside him sit ceremonial swords and a bound copy of Emperor Hirohito's rescript ending the war. He has shot himself through the left side of his abdomen, just below the heart. The bullet has torn through his body and exited his back, leaving a gaping wound. Reporters had earlier noted that Tojo had reportedly consulted a local physician in the days before to learn the precise location of his heart, and that a charcoal mark had been placed on his chest to guide the shot. He fired directly through that mark. The bullet missed the heart anyway. Wilpers, standing over the bleeding man, carefully picks up the .32 caliber pistol using a white cloth. George Burns of Yank magazine takes the photograph that will run in newspapers across America the next morning. Wilpers pointing his weapon at the slumped figure. The blood on the shirt, the swords on the table. This single image will define the moment for the American public. And here is the thing I need you to hold in your mind, because this is where the story turns into something the reporters in that room and the editors on their telephones and the 90 million Americans who will read about it tomorrow are not expecting. In the next 90 minutes, an American army surgeon is going to arrive at that house and sew the wound in Tojo's abdomen closed. An American ambulance is going to carry him to an American evacuation hospital in Yokohama. An American army sergeant from Allentown, Pennsylvania, a man named Jack Archinal, is going to lie down on a table and give a pint of his own blood so that Hideki Tojo, the man who launched the attack that killed 2,403 Americans at Pearl Harbor, can live. The blood of an American soldier is going to flow through the veins of the man Americans despise more than any living person on earth. And they are going to do it on purpose. Not because they want to save Tojo, not because they feel mercy for him, not because any doctor or nurse or sergeant in that hospital has the slightest personal interest in whether this man draws another breath. They are going to save him because the United States of America has decided, at the highest levels of its government, that this man does not get to die on his own terms. He does not get to choose his own exit. He does not get to escape into the dignity of a warrior's suicide and become a martyr in the country that worshipped him for 4 years. He has to live. He has to stand in a courtroom. He has to answer for what he did. And then, 3 years later, the same country that saved his life is going to take it back. This is the story of how America kept a war criminal alive so it could kill him properly, and of what that decision, the strangest mercy in the history of modern warfare, tells us about the country that made it. To understand why the Americans were so determined to keep Tojo breathing on the floor of that house in Setagaya, you have to understand who he was and what he had done. Not the cartoon version from the propaganda posters. Not the buck-toothed caricature with the round glasses. The real man. Because the real man was worse than the cartoon, and the cartoon was not what the Americans needed on trial. Hideki Tojo was born on December 30, 1884, in the Kojimachi district of Tokyo, the third son of Lieutenant General Hidenori Tojo. The family was of samurai descent, respectable but poor. The father had risen through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army on discipline and ruthlessness, and he passed both qualities to his son the way a blacksmith passes the hammer to his apprentice. Not as a gift, as an expectation. The younger Tojo graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1905, ranking 10th out of 363 cadets. He was not brilliant. Nobody who served with him in those early years ever used that word. What they called him was relentless. He had a capacity for bureaucratic work that bordered on compulsive. He read every document that crossed his desk. He remembered every number. He slept 4 hours a night and expected his subordinates to do the same. He served as a military attaché in Germany after the First World War, where he studied European methods of command and concluded that Japan's future depended on building an industrial military state that could rival any Western power. The army gave him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Kamisori, the razor, not because he was sharp in the intellectual sense. Because he cut through problems with a speed that left no room for second thoughts. He did not deliberate, he decided. And once he decided, the decision was final. In September 1935, Tojo was given command of the Kempeitai of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. The Kempeitai was not a police force in any Western sense of the word. It was a secret police organization that ran prisoner of war camps, administered forced labor programs, recruited women into military brothels across occupied Asia, and served as the enforcement arm of Japan's colonial occupation. Under Tojo's command, the Kempeitai expanded its surveillance network into every corner of Manchuria. Dissidents were arrested. Suspected spies were tortured. Labor conscripts from China and Korea were worked in conditions that killed them by the thousands. Tojo was a staunch supporter of General Shiro Ishii and Japan's biological warfare program. As Kempeitai commander in Manchuria, Tojo oversaw a region where Ishii's Unit 731, the infamous biological and chemical weapons research facility outside Harbin, operated with impunity. Inside that facility, men, women, and children were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax, so that Japanese scientists could study the progression of disease in living bodies. They called the subjects logs. Ishii reportedly screened films of his experiments for Tojo, who found them unpleasant, but never moved to shut the program down. At the Tokyo tribunal, Tojo was never charged for Unit 731 because the United States secretly granted Ishii and his scientists immunity in exchange for their research data. By 1937, Tojo had risen to Chief of Staff of the Kwantung Army and led units during Operation Chaha, his only real combat experience. By 1938, he was Vice Minister of War. By July 1940, he was Army Minister under Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe, championing the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy and pushing Japan closer to a confrontation with the United States that he believed was both inevitable and winnable. When President Franklin Roosevelt froze Japanese assets on July 26, 1941, cutting off what Air Force analyst Stephen Wolborski calculated was 80% of Japan's oil imports, with the stroke of a pen, Tojo became the loudest voice in the cabinet for war. The Imperial Japanese Navy held 88% of Japan's refined fuel stocks, and those stocks were burning down every month. Tojo argued that concession to America would destroy everything Japan had built in China and Manchuria. At imperial conferences, he reportedly insisted that yielding to American demands would destroy the fruits of the China incident, endanger Manchukuo, and undermine Japan's control of Korea. When Konoe resigned on October 16, 1941, Emperor Hirohito, on the advice of Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal Koichi Kido, appointed Tojo Prime Minister. He was simultaneously given the War Ministry, the Home Ministry, and briefly the Foreign and Education Ministries as well. No Japanese leader since the Meiji oligarchs of the 19th century had concentrated so much governmental power in a single pair of hands. The appointment of Tojo as Prime Minister sent a clear signal to every foreign ministry in the world. The man in charge of Japan was not a diplomat seeking compromise. He was a general who had spent his career building the machinery of conquest, and who believed that war with the West was not merely possible but necessary. The moderate voices in Tokyo who had been arguing for continued negotiation with Washington were silenced. The military faction had won. 7 weeks later, on December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor. Tojo's cabinet had overseen the decision at imperial conferences attended by the emperor himself. At his trial, years later, Tojo would accept direct responsibility for the attack. But historians such as Robert Buteau have cautioned that the decision was reached by consensus among cabinet ministers, military chiefs, and the emperor, not by Tojo's sole command. He took office barely 7 weeks before the strike. He was the man in charge, but the machinery had been turning before he sat down at the controls. What followed was the expansion of an empire that stretched across a quarter of the globe and a catalogue of human suffering that ranks among the worst in the history of modern warfare. The Bataan Death March in April 1942, in which roughly 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war were forced, marched 65 miles through the Philippine jungle in extreme heat, with almost no food or water, beaten, bayoneted, and shot if they fell behind. Between 6,000 and 11,000 of them died on the march or in the camps immediately afterward. Men who stopped to drink from roadside ditches were executed on the spot. Men who fell were bayoneted where they lay. The Japanese guards had been told that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, and that any soldier who chose captivity over death had forfeited his right to be treated as a human being. The Burma-Siam Railway, where more than 12,000 Allied prisoners of war and an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Asian forced labourers died, building a rail line through roughly 260 miles of jungle with hand tools, because the main Imperial Japanese Army needed a supply route and did not consider the lives of the workers a relevant cost. Prisoners worked 16-hour days in monsoon rains and tropical heat, fed starvation rations of rice and water, beaten for falling behind quota, and left to die of cholera, dysentery, and tropical ulcers without medical treatment. The systematic starvation and torture of prisoners across the Pacific Theatre, the forced labor of hundreds of thousands of Asian civilians in mines, factories, and military construction projects, from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. The military brothel system that enslaved an estimated 200,000 women across occupied Asia. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East found that the death rate among Western Allied prisoners held by Japan was 27.1%. That was roughly 7 times the death rate of prisoners held by Germany and Italy. For American prisoners specifically, estimates from the United States Congressional Research Service and other sources put the figure between 37 and 40%. Tojo did not personally design each of these systems, but he presided over the government that ran them. He commanded the army that enforced them. He built the political apparatus that ensured no one inside Japan questioned them, and he held the ministerial portfolios that made him directly responsible for both domestic enforcement and military policy simultaneously. As war minister, he oversaw the military regulations that governed prisoner treatment, or more precisely, the absence of treatment. There was one notable exception in his record. After the Doolittle raid in April 1942, when American B-25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier struck Tokyo in a daring symbolic attack, several American airmen were captured after crash landing in China. Some voices in the Japanese military demanded that all captured flyers be executed. Tojo reportedly opposed executing them all, arguing that mass execution would invite reprisals against Japanese prisoners held by the Allies. 3 of the 8 captured Doolittle raiders were executed anyway, and the rest were imprisoned in brutal conditions for the remainder of the war. But the fact that Tojo restrained the hardliners on that single occasion says less about his humanity than it does about his calculation. He was not a man incapable of mercy. He was a man who weighed mercy against military advantage, and almost always found it wanting. By the summer of 1944, the empire he had helped build was collapsing. The Battle of Midway, in June 1942, had shattered the offensive power of the Japanese Navy. The island-hopping campaign had pushed American forces within bombing range of the home islands. B-29 raids were reducing Japanese cities to ash. When Saipan fell in July 1944, the elder statesman turned against Tojo. The emperor withdrew his confidence. Tojo resigned on July 18, 1944, and retired from the army. He spent the last year of the war as a private citizen, firebombed and blockaded like his countrymen. Even after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Tojo opposed surrender. According to accounts of his wartime diary, an entry from around August 13, 1945, 3 days after Nagasaki, described Japan as being pushed toward a humiliating surrender and accused those who supported ending the war of cowardice. This was the man the Americans came to arrest on September 11. And this was the man who, having failed to kill himself with a pistol aimed at a mark on his own chest, was about to receive the most paradoxical gift the United States government has ever given an enemy. The gift of continued life, given so that life could later be taken away in a courtroom instead of a bedroom. The scene at the house after the gunshot was chaos of a kind that only war correspondents could appreciate. Tojo was still alive. The blood was spreading, but the breathing continued. Lieutenant Wilpers stood over him with a drawn weapon. Reporters crowded the doorway. A local Japanese physician named Dr. Tamemitsu Ebara arrived and administered basic first aid but refused to do more. Tojo had stated that he wished to die, and Ebara, following what he understood as his patient's wish, honored it. Wilpers, still armed, reportedly ordered Ebara to save Tojo. Ebara complied only partially. At 4:44 in the afternoon, Tojo regained enough consciousness to wave his arm, summoning those present to hear what he believed would be his final statement. 2 Japanese reporters recorded his words. "I am very sorry it is taking me so long to die," he said. "The Greater East Asia War was justified and righteous. I am very sorry for the nation and all the races of the greater Asiatic powers. I wait for the righteous judgment of history. I wish to commit suicide, but sometimes that fails." Cornelius Ryan stood in that room and wrote afterward that the whole scene was a cross between a Marx Brothers movie and an Irish wake. George Jones of the New York Times compared it to his days on the police beat in Manhattan. Reporters were using a telephone down the hall to call their editors. The editors kept asking the same question, "Is he dead yet?" And the reporters would yell down the hallway to check, "Hey, is he dead yet?" Press photographers, wanting a better image of the scene, reportedly placed the pistol back in Tojo's hand and asked him to hold it while they took pictures. Meanwhile, the American military was already moving. The ambulance arrived at 6:18 in the evening. Inside it was Captain James Johnson of Newark, New Jersey, a physician attached to the 1st Cavalry Division. By the time Johnson reached Tojo, nearly 2 hours had passed since the shot. Johnson examined the wound. The bullet had entered the left side of the abdomen, passed below the heart, and exited through the back. Johnson later assessed that the bullet may have nicked the lower edge of the heart, but that this would not be fatal if the heart lining was not punctured. He said plainly that Tojo had a pretty good chance of being saved. Johnson had Tojo moved from the chair to a cot. He sewed the wound closed. At 6:27, Tojo received 1 unit of blood plasma. 18 minutes later, a shot of morphine. Johnson was assisted by First Lieutenant Frank Aquino of Los Angeles and Technician 5th Grade Dominic Santa Cruz of Westfield, New Jersey. When Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, commander of the United States 8th Army, arrived at the hospital, Tojo reportedly told him not to go to any trouble for him, as he was going to die anyway. He also asked Eichelberger to cooperate to make a better Japan. Eichelberger made no reply. Tojo was transported to the 98th Evacuation Hospital in Yokohama, set up in a converted schoolhouse, and at that time one of the first American Army hospitals operating ashore in occupied Japan. Captain Charles Isbell of Carthage, Missouri, a United States Army surgeon, was awoken from sleep to perform the operation. Isbell stabilized Tojo's condition through surgery. His commanding officers described him as an outstanding surgeon and the best qualified man in general surgery in the unit. He is credited by the unit history as instrumental in saving the warlord to appear before the bar of justice. The Tojo family would later present Isbell with a sword in gratitude. He was posthumously inducted into the Carthage Hall of Heroes in 2024. His granddaughter, Amy Grimes, accepted the honor. Dr. John William Ashworth, Jr., another surgeon, also attended Tojo during his treatment. A wire photograph of Ashworth standing at Tojo's bedside was distributed across America. He went on to become chief of surgery at St. Joseph Hospital in Baltimore for 2 decades. And then came the blood. Sergeant John A. Archinal of Allentown, Pennsylvania, a member of the 98th Evacuation Hospital, was the man whose blood type matched Tojo's. In his own telling years later, the selection process was not dramatic. "You know the army," he said. "They went down the alphabet list, and my name was the first one they came to that had the right blood type." An Acme wire photographer captured the transfusion. Archinal lies on a table. Sergeant George Littlewood of Dumont, New Jersey, holds the container. Captain L. Roy Gold of Montreal performs the procedure. The blood of an American enlisted man flows into the arm of the architect of Pearl Harbor. Archinal was reportedly promised a bottle of whiskey for volunteering. He said he never received it. His wife told the press that she knew Tojo would live now with some of Jack's blood in him. Marines who heard about the transfusion told Archinal he should have let Tojo bleed to death. Archinal understood why they said it, but years later, reflecting on that afternoon, he said something that cuts to the core of everything that happened next. "I thought then, and still think, he should have been made to pay," he said, "and I'm glad he was." First, Lieutenant Rebecca Schmidt and Nurse Bertie Gorsuch were rushed by jeep from the hospital ship Marigold to Tojo's bedside. Their chief nurse was Lieutenant Colonel Grace Dick Gosnell. Schmidt, in a 1995 interview, 5 decades after the event, captured the ambivalence that ran through every American in that hospital. "I had mixed emotions about him," she said. But the staff remained completely professional. Of Tojo as a patient, she said he never seemed irritable. "We shaved him and bathed him and changed dressings. He recovered without complications. When he had eaten enough, he passed his hand across his throat and said one word, 'Full.' The doctors left the bullet inside him. It remained in his body for the rest of his life. Now comes the question the story has been building toward since the gunshot. Why? Why not let him die? Every Marine who had crawled across a Pacific beach under Japanese fire had an answer: let him bleed. Every family that had received a War Department telegram beginning with the words, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret," had an answer: let him bleed. Every survivor of Bataan, of the railway, of the camps on Formosa and Manchuria and the Philippines had an answer: let him bleed. The overwhelming majority of the American public, when polled, favored swift punishment of Japanese war leaders. Only a small fraction believed they deserved anything resembling a fair trial. And yet the official position of the United States government was that Tojo had to live, that he had to be tried, that the trial had to be conducted under rules that at least resembled justice, and that the alternative, a dead man on a floor in Setagaya with a pistol beside him, was not justice. It was an escape. The reason traces to a fight that had taken place inside the Roosevelt administration a year earlier, in the autumn of 1944, between two men who had profoundly different ideas about what victory was supposed to mean when it came. The first man was Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury. Morgenthau proposed what became known as the Morgenthau Plan. Under this plan, the senior leaders of the Axis powers, the arch-criminals, as Morgenthau called them, would be identified by Allied officers in the field and put to death forthwith by firing squad. No trial. No testimony, no defense attorney, no courtroom, just identification, a wall, and a volley. The British government initially supported this approach. Winston Churchill himself was prepared to sign off on summary execution. The logic was brutal and direct. These men started a war that killed tens of millions of human beings. They do not deserve the dignity of a courtroom. They deserve a ditch. The second man was Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War. Stimson was 77 years old. He had served in the cabinets of 4 presidents across more than 3 decades. He was a Wall Street Republican and a lifelong believer in the rule of law, and he looked at the Morgenthau Plan and saw something that appalled him. In a memorandum to President Roosevelt dated September 9, 1944, preserved in the Foreign Relations of the United States Archive, Stimson wrote that any procedure used to punish Axis leaders must embody, in his judgment, at least the rudimentary aspects of the Bill of Rights. Notification to the accused of the charge, the right to be heard, and within reasonable limits, the right to call witnesses in his defense. He argued that the very punishment of these men in a dignified manner consistent with the advance of civilization would have all the greater effect upon posterity. He denounced summary execution as contrary to everything the Allies claimed to stand for. Stimson won the argument. It was not easy. Morgenthau had Roosevelt's ear. Churchill was sympathetic to summary justice. The American public, whose sons and brothers had died in Japanese prison camps, had no appetite for legal proceedings that might take years. But Stimson, 77 years old and carrying the weight of a career spent in the law, made the case that history would judge the victors not by the speed of their punishment, but by the fairness of it. A firing squad would give the world 15 minutes of satisfaction and a century of second-guessing. A trial, even an imperfect trial, would create a record. It would let the evidence speak. It would force the world to look at what these men had actually done, in detail, under oath, with documents and witnesses and cross-examination. And it would establish, for the first time in human history, that a head of government could be held personally accountable for crimes committed in the name of the state. Stimson's lawyer, Murray Bernays, developed the conspiracy trial framework that would be used at Nuremberg first and Tokyo second. President Truman backed the approach. And the principle that emerged from that fight, the principle that Archinal's blood was keeping alive in Tojo's veins that September evening in Yokohama, was this. The United States would not shoot its enemies in ditches. It would put them in courtrooms. It would give them lawyers. It would let them speak in their own defense. And then, if the evidence proved their guilt under the standards the court had established, it would carry out the sentence in the open, under observation, with the world watching. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, captured the logic in a single passage that applies with equal force to what happened in Tokyo. "You must put no man on trial if you are not willing to see him freed if not proved guilty," Jackson said. "If we want to shoot Germans as a matter of policy, let it be done as such, but do not hide the deed behind a court." That was the principle. The practice, as it unfolded in a former army ministry building in central Tokyo, would prove considerably more complicated. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East opened on May 3, 1946, in the War Ministry building at Ichigaya in central Tokyo. The building itself was a theatre of deliberate inversion. The room where Tojo had once held wartime cabinet meetings now served as the courtroom where 11 nations sat in judgment of his government. His former office became a meeting room for the Allied judges. The tribunal was modelled on Nuremberg, but differed in ways that would shape everything that followed. Nuremberg had 4 chief prosecutors, one from each major Allied power, each representing a sovereign legal tradition. Tokyo had one, an American named Joseph Keenan. Historian Douglas Linder bluntly judged Keenan a bad choice, noting that he lacked the intellect and eloquence of Robert Jackson, knew next to nothing about Asia, and was an alcoholic. 11 nations supplied judges. Sir William Webb of Australia was appointed as the presiding judge. The trial would run for 2.5 years, from May 1946 to November 1948, making it one of the longest criminal proceedings in history. But the most consequential difference between Nuremberg and Tokyo was not the structure of the prosecution or the length of the trial. It was the absence of one man. Emperor Hirohito was not on trial. He was not indicted. He was not called as a witness. He was not mentioned, if it could possibly be avoided, in any proceeding. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate policy decision made at the highest levels of the American government and enforced by the most powerful man in occupied Japan. A Truman administration directive ordered General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, to take no action against the emperor as a war criminal without explicit authorization from Washington. MacArthur concluded independently that removing or indicting Hirohito, who was regarded by millions of Japanese as a living god and the spiritual center of the national identity, would make Japan ungovernable. It would require, MacArthur estimated, a vastly larger occupation force and risk an insurgency that could drag on for years. MacArthur's military secretary, Brigadier General Bonnefellers, conducted a systematic campaign of interviews with Japanese leaders between September 1945 and March 1946, working to construct the narrative that Hirohito had been a passive constitutional monarch who had opposed the war but had been powerless to stop his generals. Fellers reportedly told Japanese Navy Minister Yonai directly that it would be most convenient if the Japanese side could prove to the Americans that the emperor was completely blameless. The implication was not subtle. Fellers was telling the Japanese government what story the Americans wanted to hear and inviting them to build it. American public opinion ran the other direction. According to polling at the time, roughly 1/3 of Americans favored executing Hirohito. Another 1/10 or more wanted him imprisoned for life. Australia and Britain pressed for his prosecution. The decision to shield the emperor was made over the objections of multiple Allied governments and against the wishes of the American electorate. It was made by MacArthur and ratified by Truman because the men running the occupation concluded that the political cost of governing Japan without its emperor was higher than the moral cost of letting him go free. This created a structural problem at the heart of the Tokyo Tribunal that no amount of legal architecture could hide. If the emperor was blameless, then someone else had to bear the full weight of everything the emperor's government had done. That someone was Tojo. The Americans needed a living, speaking Tojo who would stand in the dock, absorb the guilt of the entire war, and by his very presence confirm the fiction that the emperor had been a helpless figurehead manipulated by his generals. A dead Tojo, one who had bled out on the floor of his own house with a pistol beside him, would have been a martyr who escaped justice and left the central question of war responsibility unanswered. A living Tojo who could be convicted, sentenced, and hanged after a public trial visible to the entire world, served both purposes at once. It satisfied the demand for accountability, and it protected the emperor. This is the deep logic behind saving him, not mercy, strategy. The blood transfusion was not an act of compassion, it was an act of statecraft. Tojo, to the surprise of nearly everyone in the courtroom, did not cooperate with the narrative the prosecution had built for him. He became the unexpected star of the trial. While most of the other 27 defendants sat passively and said as little as possible, Tojo fought. He arrived at the witness stand on December 26, 1947, and for the next several days he delivered testimony that turned the prosecution's strategy inside out. He defended Japan's wartime policies with vigor and specificity. He challenged the prosecution's evidence on particular points of fact. He argued, with what Time magazine described as the unearthly smugness of the samurai, that the war had been one of self-defense forced on Japan by Western economic strangulation, racial exclusion from international markets, and the deliberate encirclement of the Japanese home islands by hostile powers. He rejected the premise of the tribunal itself. He argued that the charges of crimes against peace had no basis in international law as it existed in 1941. He argued that the Western powers had themselves engaged in wars of conquest across Asia for centuries and had no moral standing to judge Japan for doing the same. He argued that the oil embargo and asset freeze imposed by the United States had left Japan with no alternative but to fight or starve. He was articulate, organized, and unapologetic. When asked directly whether he bore responsibility for ordering the attack on Pearl Harbor, Tojo did not flinch. He did not equivocate. He did not look at his lawyers. "Yes," he said, "I am responsible." Japanese public interest in the trial surged. Newspapers described a phenomenon they called Tojo popularity. For the first time since the surrender, ordinary Japanese citizens were seeing one of their own leaders stand up to the occupying powers and refuse to bow. The man who had been despised as a failed war leader, the man who had lost everything, was becoming something dangerously close to a folk hero simply by refusing to apologize. He would contend to the last, he said, that it was a war of self-defense. Many Western observers judged his testimony a complete fiasco for the Allied prosecution. And then, on December 31, 1947, Tojo said the one thing that the entire occupation apparatus had been engineered to prevent. Under cross-examination, Tojo strayed from the carefully maintained line protecting the emperor. He referred to Hirohito's ultimate authority over matters of war and peace. He stated, in effect, that no Japanese subject could or would ever act against the emperor's will. The implication was immediate and devastating. If no subject could act against the emperor's will, and Tojo had launched a war, then the emperor had willed the war. The courtroom went silent. The American prosecution team, which had spent 2 years building the legal and political architecture to keep the emperor untouched, watched the entire structure crack in a single sentence from their own principal defendant. What happened next was the most revealing moment of the entire tribunal, and it happened entirely behind closed doors. The prosecution arranged, through a former Japanese general named Ryukichi Tanaka, who had close personal ties to Chief Prosecutor Keenan, for Tojo to be coached to reverse his testimony. Tanaka served as the intermediary. Tojo was persuaded that protecting the emperor was his duty as a loyal subject, and that his words in court had endangered the man he had served his entire career. When Tojo returned to the witness stand in early 1948, he amended his statement. He retracted the implication about the emperor and restored the approved narrative. It was, as one scholar noted, the only point during the entire tribunal when the actions of the emperor surfaced in open court. It was also the point at which the tribunal revealed itself most clearly for what it was. Not just a trial, a carefully managed performance in which one man was being used to absorb the guilt that belonged, at least in part, to another. Historian Herbert Bix later argued that these extraordinary measures to save Hirohito had a lasting and profoundly distorting impact on Japanese understanding of the war. John Dower wrote that the cover-up turned the entire issue of war responsibility into a joke. Indian Justice Radha Binod Pal wrote a sweeping dissent, arguing for the acquittal of every defendant on the grounds that the tribunal was applying retroactive law. The French judge dissented. The Dutch judge dissented. Presiding Judge Webb himself publicly criticized the immunity granted to the emperor. On November 12, 1948, the tribunal delivered its judgment over 7 days. All 25 remaining defendants were found guilty on at least one charge. 7 men were sentenced to death by hanging. Tojo was among them. When Webb read the sentence, he declared that Tojo bore major responsibility for Japan's criminal attacks on her neighbors. Tojo stood, bowed to the court, and spoke 5 words. "It is a victor's trial." Then he sat down. He was right, and the Americans knew he was right, and they held the trial anyway, because the alternative, Henry Morgenthau's ditch, was worse. After the verdict, Tojo was returned to Sugamo Prison in Tokyo, where he had been held since his recovery from the gunshot wound. The prison was run exclusively by American military personnel on MacArthur's direct orders. What the guards found in their famous prisoner was not the iron-fisted dictator of the propaganda posters. They found a quiet, cooperative, almost meek old man. Guard Charles Patterson said Tojo was not treated any differently than any other prisoner. In fact, he served meals to the other prisoners. Guard Howard Gast supplied Tojo with Barbasol shaving cream and was personally responsible for confiscating his razor blade after each shave because of the suicide risk. Gast could see the scar on Tojo's abdomen when the old man bathed. A reminder, every day, that Tojo had already tried to leave on his own terms, and that the Americans had prevented it. The night Tojo first arrived at Sugamo, military police guards reportedly gave him a beating. But his treatment improved afterward, and by the time the trial was underway, the relationship between prisoner and guards had settled into something resembling a grim routine. Sergeant Dearman, who oversaw the cell block housing Tojo and 27 other senior leaders, said there were no problems. Each man was kept in a single cell, watched 24 hours a day, required to sleep with his hands visible above the blankets under a dim light that was never turned off. The guards rotated shifts, but the rules did not change. No razor unsupervised, no belt, no shoelaces after lights out. The Americans were not going to lose this prisoner to himself a second time. Tojo kept a prison diary that eventually ran to thousands of pages. He wrote with a discipline that mirrored his wartime work habits, filling page after page with reflections on the trial, on the emperor, on the meaning of Japan's defeat. He confided to the Buddhist chaplain, Ryujun Tajima, that he wished to die, not as a protest, not as defiance, simply as an end to a process that he understood had only one conclusion. And then there is the story of the teeth. Tojo's teeth were in terrible condition. Nearly all of his upper teeth had to be extracted, and he requested dentures so he could speak clearly during his trial. The work fell to 2 United States Navy dentists on loan to the Army at the 361st Station Hospital. Lieutenant Junior Grade Dr. George Foster, an oral surgeon, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Dr. Jack Mallory, a 22-year-old dental prosthetics officer who happened to be an amateur ham radio operator familiar with Morse code. Encouraged by colleagues who thought the idea was hilarious, Mallory did something that would have earned him a court-martial if it had been discovered in time. Along the inside border of Tojo's upper denture plate, where the acrylic met the gum line, Mallory drilled a message in Morse code, dots and dashes cut directly into the plastic. The message read, "Remember Pearl Harbor." For roughly 3 months, between late 1946 and early 1947, the man who approved the attack on Pearl Harbor walked around his prison cell, ate his meals, testified at his own trial, and argued for the righteousness of his cause with the words, "Remember Pearl Harbor" carved into the teeth in his mouth. He never knew. The secret leaked when a colleague of Mallory's wrote home to Texas about it, and the story reached a local radio station. Mallory and Foster realized they faced serious consequences. On the night of February 14, 1947, they slipped into Sugamo Prison, had a guard wake Tojo for what they described as emergency dental work, and ground the Morse code off the plate, while Tojo sat confused in the dental chair at 2 in the morning. The next day, the military newspaper, Stars and Stripes, published the story. A furious colonel summoned both dentists and demanded to know if there was any truth to the report that "Remember Pearl Harbor" was inscribed in the dentures. Both men answered, truthfully by that point, "No, sir." Mallory later described Tojo as very humble and just a meek little guy. When offered a complete set of dentures, including a lower plate, Tojo declined the lower. He said he would not be needing the teeth for long. Every like on this video keeps stories like these. Stories about the people behind the history, visible to the audience that cares about getting them right. That matters more than I can say. The final appeals were denied. MacArthur, in what he described as a difficult decision, declined to commute any of the 7 death sentences. The United States Supreme Court, in the case known as Hirota versus MacArthur, voted 5-4 to hear arguments, then ruled that it had no jurisdiction to review the tribunal's judgments. The 7 condemned men had exhausted every legal avenue. Tojo spent his final days writing letters, composing poetry, and playing cards with fellow prisoners. He penned a haiku that translates roughly as, "Oh look, see how the cherry blossoms fall mutely." In a final letter, he expressed 2 wishes. He wished the judges had allowed him to take sole responsibility for the war so that the other defendants might have been spared. And he expressed gratitude that the emperor had been protected. Even at the end, he was still playing the role the Americans had assigned him. On the evening of December 22, 1948, each condemned man was permitted 1 hour with the Buddhist priest Shinsho Hanayama. Final services were held in an improvised chapel inside the prison. Tojo had already sent a lock of hair and a fingernail clipping to his wife, following Japanese custom. At the chapel, he handed the priest his glasses and his false teeth, the same dentures that had once carried a secret message in Morse code, to be delivered to her as well. Just after midnight, in the first minutes of December 23, 1948, the 7 men were led from their cells into a frost-rimmed courtyard at Sugamo Prison. They wore United States Army surplus work clothes stripped of all insignia. The executions were carried out in 2 groups. Tojo, Iwane Matsui, Kenji Doihara, and Akira Muto went first. The remaining three, Koki Hirota, Seishiro Itagaki, and Heitaro Kimura, waited in the chapel. Members of the Allied Council witnessed the proceedings. William Siebold represented the United States. General Shang Chen represented China. Patrick Shaw represented the British Commonwealth. Lieutenant General Kuzma Derevianko represented the Soviet Union. The official execution protocol specified that the proceedings would be witnessed with due solemnity and carried out with military precision, with every precaution taken to prevent undue suffering. Iwane Matsui, the eldest among the first group, raised the final cry, "Tenno Heika Banzai," may the Emperor live 10,000 years. The others took up the call, "Banzai, Banzai, Banzai." On the command to proceed, the trapdoors opened. An American Army physician present at the execution, Dr. Leroy Lamb, described the scene afterward. "They just looked like old men," he said. The hood was placed over their heads, the noose was put on, and with great precision, they all dropped, just like a sack of potatoes. Within 30 minutes, all 7 were dead. Tojo was 63 years old, 1 week short of his 64th birthday. The bodies were taken to Yokohama and cremated. To prevent any grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for ultra-nationalists, the ashes were loaded onto an 8th Army liaison plane and scattered over the Pacific Ocean roughly 30 miles east of Yokohama. A memorandum stamped secret, signed by United States Army Major Luther Frierson, reads, "I certify that I received the remains, supervised cremation, and personally scattered the ashes of the following executed war criminals at sea." The man whose life had been saved by American blood was gone. The blood went with him into the Pacific. Jack Archinal went home to Allentown and lived a quiet life. He did not seek recognition for what he had done. When reporters tracked him down years later, he spoke plainly and without self-importance. He never stopped believing he had done the right thing, not because he liked Tojo, not because he forgave Tojo, because he believed that a man should be made to pay for what he had done, and that making him pay required keeping him alive long enough to face the reckoning. The whiskey he was promised never arrived. The blood he gave accomplished exactly what it was supposed to accomplish. It kept the man alive long enough to be judged. Captain James Johnson went back to Newark, New Jersey, and returned to medical practice. He had saved the life of a man the entire country wanted dead, and he had done it because that was what a doctor does. A doctor does not choose whose wounds to sew based on whether the patient deserves to live. He sews the wound because the wound is there. Captain Charles Isbell went back to Carthage, Missouri. He was posthumously inducted into the city's Hall of Heroes in 2024. His granddaughter, Amy Grimes, accepted the honor. The sword the Tojo family gave him in gratitude, a gift from the family of a man he had been ordered to save, so that the man could be ordered to die, remains one of the stranger artifacts of the Pacific War. First Lieutenant Rebecca Schmidt went back to Baltimore and gave one interview about the experience in 1995, 50 years after the fact. She said she had mixed emotions. She said the staff remained completely professional. She did not claim to be proud or ashamed. She said what needed to be said and left the rest to the people who were not in the room. Jack Mallory, the 22-year-old dentist who drilled Remember Pearl Harbor into Tojo's teeth, went home and carried a story that nobody believed the first time he told it, and that everybody wanted to hear the second time. He had done something juvenile and extraordinary. He had smuggled the memory of December 7, 1941, into the mouth of the man who made it happen. It was an act of defiance, so small that the man wearing it never noticed, and so large that it became one of the most repeated stories of the entire war in the Pacific. So here is the answer to the question this investigation has been asking since 4:21 on a September afternoon in the suburb of Setagaya. Why save him? Why pump the blood of an American sergeant into the veins of the man who ordered Pearl Harbor? Why wake a surgeon in the middle of the night to repair the body of a man you are already building a gallows for? The easy answer is politics. The Americans needed a living defendant. They needed a face for the prosecution. They needed a man who could stand in a dock and absorb the guilt that could not be allowed to touch the emperor. That answer is true. It is also incomplete. The deeper answer is the one Stimson was reaching for in his memo, and Jackson articulated at Nuremberg, and that Sergeant Archinal expressed in his own plain way when he said, "I thought then and still think he should have been made to pay." The United States in 1945 was a country that had just finished fighting the most destructive war in human history against regimes that had abolished the rule of law. Germany had replaced courts with racial tribunals. Japan had replaced justice with imperial decree. The entire moral argument of the Allied cause was that there was a difference between civilized nations and what the Axis had become. If the Americans had let Tojo bleed out on his floor, if Henry Morgenthau's firing squads had carried the day, then the victors would have been doing in the moment of their victory the very thing they had spent 4 years telling the world was wrong: killing without judgment, deciding guilt without evidence, executing without appeal, doing exactly what Tojo's own Kempeitai had done to prisoners across the Pacific, killing first and explaining later, or not explaining at all. The trial was not for Tojo, the trial was for the future. It was a precedent written in court transcripts and cross-examinations and dissenting opinions that said even the worst human being on earth is entitled to hear the charges against him, to speak in his own defense, and to be judged before he is punished. That the act of judging and the act of killing are two different things, and that a country which cannot tell the difference between the two has already lost something more important than a war. Was the Tokyo Tribunal perfect? It was deeply flawed. The emperor was shielded by political decision. The key witness was coached to recant his most honest testimony. The defense was constrained. 3 of 11 judges dissented. Tojo was right that it was a victor's trial, but the alternative was not a better trial. The alternative was no trial at all. The alternative was the ditch. In 1978, Tojo and the 6 other executed war criminals were enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. Every visit by a Japanese Prime Minister to Yasukuni draws formal protests from China and South Korea to this day. The ashes the Americans scattered at sea were reportedly gathered in part from the crematorium before the plane took off, and later placed in a temple. The man the Americans tried to erase found his way back into the national memory anyway. But the principle the Americans established when they saved his life, that principle never needed to come back. It never left. It is still present in every international criminal tribunal, in every war crimes proceeding, in every argument about whether the most dangerous human beings on the planet are entitled to a legal defense before they are punished. It is there because Henry Stimson wrote a memorandum in 1944, because Robert Jackson made a promise at Nuremberg, because a sergeant from Allentown, Pennsylvania, whose name most people have never heard, lay down on a table in a converted schoolhouse in Yokohama and gave his blood to keep alive a man he had every reason to hate. Tojo tried to die at 4:21 on a September afternoon. America would not let him. 3 years later, at 12:01 on a December morning, America took his life back. But it took it differently. It took it after a trial, after testimony, after a verdict, after appeals, after a judgment that, however imperfect, was rendered in a courtroom and not beside a wall. That is the difference Stimson fought for. That is the difference Archinal's blood purchased. The difference between a country that kills its enemies and a country that judges them first and then carries out the sentence with the lights on and the record open and the whole world watching. If this investigation gave you something to think about, that like button matters. It tells the algorithm that history told with the names and the contradictions and the uncomfortable truths intact is worth showing to more people. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men in extraordinary situations who were asked to do something that no training manual covered, not on a battlefield but in a hospital room, a courtroom, a prison chapel, or a dentist's chair, and who did what needed to be done because somebody had to, and the somebody was them.